Wilson? Wilson? Where are you, Wilson? Am I the only one that gets that reference? Anyway, we've got the new Wilson D9 irons to test out today. Now I've got a full set of the new Wilson D9 irons here. Now these are a game improvement offering, and this year the tech is all about giving you more distance, but also giving you a higher ball flight so you can get those balls landing softly on the green. As we've got a full set here, I'm going to work all the way through the range. I want to look at the gapping and see just how consistent the distance is, and also how consistent that ball flight is. Right, let's get on with it. So this set runs all the way down to the sand wedge, which I've got here, and this is the equivalent of a 53-degree wedge. Now obviously it looks pretty different to a typical kind of gap wedge that you might carry, and the first thing off is that the sole looks quite big. But I have to say that when you put it down on the ground, because there's so much kind of camber and curve on this, you can't feel it against the floor, and it doesn't feel like you've got a lot of ground to deal with when you're interacting with the turf, and also because of the loft of the club, you can't really see it either. It feels very soft off the face. Definitely got a pretty consistent, nice high ball flight here. So that averaged out at 91 yards, which is fine for a sand wedge, but I probably would have expected it to go a little bit further, given all the technology that I packed into these clubs to help with distance. Having said that, a key thing about this range is how high they launch and how soft they land, and this was really consistent with this club, and I had a really nice trajectory. I was really happy with both my front to back and my left to right dispersion, and on top of that my spin averaged out at 9,500, which is really good because sometimes in a more game improvement distance style club you don't necessarily get that spin number as high as you'd want in the shorter clubs, so definitely really happy with that. But let's go hit the rest of the set and see what the gapping's like and how much distance I get out of some of those longer clubs. Okay, so we've got a similar shape in here, but the top line is a bit more obvious. Now we have less loft on it and we can see it a bit more. Another thing to note here is that the toe on the hosel of these clubs is kind of that shiny metallic colour, whereas the club face is more matted, so you've got quite a distinct difference between the two. Now personally for me that doesn't bother me at all, but I think it is quite a strong visual and you need to be comfortable with that, so for someone who prefers an all matte club, that's definitely an important thing to know. That was lovely. I have to say these feel really easy to hit. I have to say I'm striking these particularly well. This actually feels a bit easier to hit than the sand wedge. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just because I'm not used to having a sand wedge that matches my set, but then obviously when I get into the pitching wedge I'm a bit more comfortable. So the pitching wedge averaged out at 123 yards there. And not only is that a pretty big pitching wedge for me, probably maybe nearly 10 yards more than I would expect, it's also nearly 30 yards longer than what we had in the sand wedge. Now that's a pretty big gap, but I do have to say if you were getting this full set, there is a gap wedge that goes in the middle, so if you're looking at more like a 15-yard gap I would expect between these two. I don't know what it is about this club. I've got the 9-iron here, and the club head just feels a bit heavier than it did with the other ones. Oh, that was a lovely strike. I think it flew quite a bit further than the other ones though. So the gapping was much more what I'd expected to be there. This averaged out at 135 yards, so the gapping was 12 yards between this and the pitching wedge. Generally I would expect about 10 yards between my clubs, so I think that's pretty good. Spin was just under 6,000, so perhaps a little bit low. Another thing I noticed was, because of the width of the sole, I felt like the strikes were a little bit matty, so I was pulling them a little bit left. Not drastically, but definitely noticeable. If you struggle with ball flight, you need a set of these because these things are so easy to launch. When you strike these good, they do feel really solid, but there is quite a noticeable difference between a centre strike and anything that's caught a bit off centre. That was a really solid ball flight. I actually found that one a bit easier to hit. I'm not really sure why, but my dispersion was definitely a lot straighter and not skewed to the left as much as I saw with the 9. Now, this definitely went a long way. I was averaging 150 with this, which is more like a good 7-iron distance for me, and it did mean that there's 15 yards between this and the 9. Now, also when we look at front to back dispersion, there's a few shots that I struck quite a bit better than the others, and they flew like 8 yards further. Okay, when we get to the 7-iron here, there's probably the point where for me, the top line and stuff like that becomes a bit chunky, but I have to say what I'm impressed with is there actually isn't that much offset on these at all. I can find that a little bit off-putting, so that's definitely a bonus for me. Strike felt a bit toey, but it still flew really nice. That's just flown 167 yards with a 7-iron. That's not my 5-iron distance. It's kind of weird because I don't even feel like I'm striking them my best. Maybe it's just because I can feel more turf interaction from the thicker sole, but then it sets off and flies really far. Like, that still pitched 168 and I didn't even think I hit it good. Oh, I ripped that. That's gone a long way. You know what, I was really impressed with just how consistent the ball flight was from shot to shot there. Each trajectory was nearly identical. I think it's quite rare to have that level of consistency in a more game improvement style club. Now, my other variable is really good too. I carried this 167, which is definitely a long way for a 7-iron, and it is also 17 yards further than the 8-iron, so quite big gap in there. But for this club, the distance front to back was really consistent, which is definitely something I'm impressed with. Okay, 6-iron now. Over the ball here, I can actually see like the back of the club head here sticking out behind the top line. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Definitely flying a little bit lower than what we've seen in the others, but that just rolled onto the green at 200 yards with a 6-iron. Oh, I flushed that. Right, that was kind of weird because I'd say like the first 3 I struck alright, and then the 4th I definitely caught a bit matty and dropped down like 8 yards. But then the last one I felt like I struck really well. I absolutely ripped it. I was expecting it to fly a lot further than the others, and they were basically all the same. Now, some might say that's a negative thing, but I think from my point of view, if you're looking into this kind of set, you're looking for more forgiveness and you're wanting more consistency. So I think having those kind of not quite as good strikes still able to fly as far as your good ones is a real positive. Again, these went a long way. These averaged out at 175 carry, but it was noticeable that this flew a little bit lower than the others and the descent angle wasn't quite as good. So pair that with a slightly lower spin, you're not going to get quite the amount of stopping power from this 6-iron. Felt pretty nice. Pitched on the green. Imagine being on a 200-yard par 3 and being able to pull out 5-iron to hit the green. I mean, it just doesn't happen. I'd be using like a 3 hybrid or a 3 wood. So that averaged out at 188, which was 13 yards longer than the 6-iron. Apart from one random shot that flew out at 196, which was definitely new for me with a 5-iron, the rest were pretty consistent. I would say again though, this flew a bit lower, and I did have some shots that were quite considerably lower than the rest, so not quite as consistent in terms of ball flight. Also, typically for me with a bigger club head, I often turn them over quite a lot, but I've been really impressed with these throughout the bag in just how kind of consistent and straight the dispersion has been. Okay, so what's impressed me the most about this range? I have to say first off, the flight and the height of these was super consistent, especially between the sandwich and the 7-iron. I think if you're someone who needs extra height and needs to launch it more easily, these are definitely going to do the trick. I would say though, in the 6 and the 5, it wasn't quite as good and it was a little bit lower, but to be honest, I think if you're someone who really needs to launch it a lot more, you probably should be looking at hybrids in those clubs anyways, rather than these longer irons. Overall, for this game improvement category of club, the dispersion was pretty good too. And I have to say, visually for me, usually this kind of club has a lot of offset, there's a lot less on these, which is definitely nicer to look at behind the ball, and it also helps me hit them a bit straighter. There's a lot of tech packed in these clubs to increase your ball speed. and you can definitely see these goes a long way. I mean, a 196 yard fly on a 5-iron for me is just ridiculous. Now obviously because of that more distance you're going to have bigger gaps between your clubs, but I have to say it was pretty consistent as we moved up the bag, so I don't think this is anything to worry about. To purchase this set is about £500. For the performance we've seen today, that is ridiculously good value for money. Right, that's all for today. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below or drop me a line on Twitter or Instagram. If you want to see how the rest of the D9 range performed, you can check out my D9 Metalwoods review in the equipment playlist. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications too, so you're alerted when a new video goes live. And if you're after more golf content, head to the National Club Golfer social media channels for more.